I guess the first question is, tell me who Donald J. Riley was.
I'm still finding that out. But what I'm learning that I love is that he was human, because I was raised with the idea that my dad was a hero, and he was very much a hero. But I was raised seeing his medals on the wall, knowing what those medals were, and knowing that he died saving lives, or at least attempting to, and had saved a lot of lives. And that's a lot to live up to. And, he and my mom ended up being married only 10 years before he was killed. And, he died at the prime of life. So he was sort of like trapped in amber. He's never going to get any older. And, of course, everything that I had of him was through her very gauzy memories. And he was the love of her life. She never got over him dying. But as I got older and had the opportunity to talk to other relatives and meet relatives, including a cousin who's up in his 90s now, who wanted to call me and let me know that my dad was a punk. Because they'd gone to the same high school in St. Louis, and he's like, I was the one who was a straight A student. Your dad was the one, it was a military high school. Your dad was the one whose shirt tail was out, and he's always getting in a fight. He was a total punk, and I loved it. It's like, I loved it. I think the military gave him that discipline that he needed, but he always had a fierce, independent streak, and that's what I've found out about him over the years, including just even at the, after the ceremony in Arlington, we met in an Irish bar. It was a big Irish family. And I had the cousin, the son of one of my cousins, I'd never met before, who was in the Navy, explained that he'd been digging into my dad's citations, and he said, your dad was a cowboy, and then he explained about how he kind of went out against orders. He just decided he was going to go back and get the guys. If his helicopter got shot up, he went back and they said, this is not flyable. He's like, I'm going to get another helicopter. And he did that 3 times and won the Silver Star for that, and he was the third person to try to save people in a hail of bullets when he ended up getting killed. But he did what he thought he needed to do, even if it meant breaking some rules and not always following orders. And I think that shows that everything is sort of a sliding scale. Following orders is not always the best way to go. You got to follow your heart, I think. So anyway, that was great to know. So I think he was very fiercely dedicated to his fellow Marines. Very human. He was also really intelligent. He was going for his PhD, and apparently had barely passed high school. But when he found his thing, that was his thing. The Marines were his thing. Flying was his thing. Something else he used to get in trouble for, by the way, because my mom told me this actually, is he would get up when he was a jet pilot. Before he was a helicopter pilot, he would get up 45,000 feet or something, and he would turn off his communications, which you're not supposed to do. And he would sing and he would yell and just let out all his stress. And then he would land there like, what happened? He's like, I don't know, something happened. But yeah, he would deliberately do that. And I don't know, it made him human. And I love that. But like I said, I'm still learning about him, and that's everything I learn is just precious to me because I don't have any memory of him myself.
Like you said, growing up, the medals were on the wall.
Yeah.
What do you first remember about hearing the stories of his heroic actions, of saving lives, of those kind of things? When did you first hear those things?
I don't remember not ever hearing about them. Mm-hmm. It was, the way I've described it was like, I think it's in California somewhere, there's a tree that has a hole in it big enough you can drive a car through.
Okay.
And I feel like that was our family. That whole, his absence created this, it was a powerful absence. My mother was so devoted to him. She was so insistent that he not be forgotten, that we knew about him. And she didn't know much about his upbringing. She didn't know that. She'd met his family. They'd been married 10 years. But what I got from him was from this 10-year slice. And what he did, what he was like before I was able to remember him, when he was just a dad and a guy and her husband, and then what he did in Vietnam, and that's all I knew. So, but it was a lot to live up to. Not that I have or did, it just was it was a lot. I just knew him as a hero, and she made it. She really focused on the fact that he was killed saving people, that he was a medevac pilot. I mean, he did other things. He was a jet pilot. He did not always fly medevac, but that's what he preferred to do. And that's where he would go in and go against orders. And that's where he just, I think, felt that he had a deep responsibility to do what I would hope any human would do. I don't know that that's always true, but that he would hope somebody would have done for him. And so, yeah, I just grew up hearing stories about him, honestly, the same stories, over and over. But I would just ply her for information, but she didn't have that much, really. 10 years isn't a long time. I've been married almost 40 years. 10 years isn't a long time. And I didn't come to appreciate that until I got quite a bit older, that's a little slice. So.
Yeah, and considering the amount of that time that he was gone.
Yeah.
He wasn't home for chunks of that time.
Yeah, because after she passed in 2019, then she gave me permission to read his letters, and she had a box of them from Vietnam. But also there were letters from when he was deployed to Japan. He was deployed a lot, and so she was alone a lot. And but I also, reading his letters was fascinating to me, because I didn't do that until after she died, because it just felt like a violation of her privacy. I would never have done it to this day had she not given me permission, but I didn't even ask until she was close enough to the end of her life that I felt like it was appropriate. And if she had said no, I wouldn't have read them.
So you were 3 when he was killed in action?
I was 3, but he'd been gone 8 months. So I was 2 when he left.
And he died December of 65.
December 9th, 1965.
So the war, obviously we had troops there years before, but the first full-scale Army unit that was involved that was around Thanksgiving of 65. So the full-on war was pretty new at that point.
Yeah, and you can see it in his letters. You can see the progression, because at first, he's bored. He's just bored. There's nothing to do, and then he has to ferry around politicians, which he just found incredibly annoying. And then suddenly, you can just see in the letters where suddenly things got hot, and his letters got significantly shorter. His writing got looser. You can see, how suddenly he got thrust into some pretty heavy-duty stuff, and he didn't last that long.
He was flying helicopters. Do you know what he flew?
Huey. He flew a Huey. My cousin's son described them as just like these hulks of steel, and he talked about how the guys would drink beer, flatten the cans and use the cans to patch the helicopters. It was just like, God, flying in a tin can.
It's a wild thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
You told me on the phone that some of your first memories, maybe your first memory, is when you were at DC,
mm-hmm.
the ceremony there.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me that story.
That is my first memory. So when he was killed, I didn't understand what it was at the time. And in fact, I didn't understand what it was for several years, actually. But he was killed in December 65. I had just turned 3. And my mother was presented with his medals in September of '66 because he was, at that time, probably not anymore I'm sure, but at that time the most decorated Marine of the Vietnam War. He'd won everything but the Medal of Honor. And I do remember in sort of images, I remember colors because I remember the sky was incredibly blue. The ceremony was behind the Marine Corps barracks in DC. And I remember how blue the sky was because honestly, when we buried him last week, the sky was that blue. I remember my mom was wearing sort of an olive drab, like a marine green, suit, skirt, and jacket. I remember holding the general's hand, General Wallace Green. I remember holding his hand because he was wearing a white glove, and that struck me as odd to see a man wearing a glove. And in my other hand, I was holding a little orange chenille Easter chick, like a little wire chick that my sister apparently had saved from Easter, and brought it on the airplane and pressed it into my hand at the last minute to make sure that I wasn't gonna squirm, because she was about 5 years older than me. So she was just making sure, because I was kind of a punk too. So anyway, so yeah, I do. That is literally my first memory.
Yeah. So tell me what you know. I forget the name of the operation. Tell me what you know about the combat action where he lost his life.
I've read about it. There's a lot online about it, and that's where I really found out. My mom didn't seem to know much about it. She told me that, actually she told me, and she died believing that he lay for hours on the battlefield. And that apparently is not true, because I found a firsthand account 2 or 3 months ago online. It's been there for a while. It's just all this disparate stuff is like all over the internet. And it was, my dad had, he was a 3rd helicopter trying to free these, I believe, 11 men who were sort of trapped by enemy fire, and a lot of them were injured. And this was written by one of those men who did end up surviving, and the way he described it was, one helicopter came in and immediately drew fire, flew off. Another one came in, same thing, flew off. My dad knew that was happening, so he came in with his lights off. He had someone guide him in with a flashlight, and they started firing, and he just kept going. And he was the only person killed. So he got shot in the back of the neck. And the way this man described it was pulling him out of the wreckage. And he said, he struck me as a man of medium stature, but he must have been a man of giant determination to do what he did. And he talked about laying him with his head on a rice paddy, and for the I guess medevac to come pick up. And in fact, his when I had his body disinterred, which Arlington disinterred and cremated, which Arlington required, that toe tag was still there.
Tell me about the process. I know you said that you started years ago of trying to. I guess start with the reason that you wanted to do this to start with.
Yeah, I did it because I felt, as my mom felt, that his sacrifice needed to be remembered, and he needed to be remembered. And he was not buried in Arlington. That I'm sure was an option available, but I think her family, her big brother, who was a good big brother in Memphis, and just trying to take the burden off of her, sort of made what I assume was a unilateral decision to have my dad buried in a cemetery close to our home in Memphis, so we could go visit his grave. And the fact is, my mom would say, that's not where he is. That's not where he is. We never visited his grave. In fact, she was not, she was devastated. I'm not I don't know what she was like before. She was a wonderful, compassionate person, but she felt everything very deeply. And I think she just never recovered. So she could not bring herself to go visit his grave. I couldn't have found his grave. And I mean, it was just a few minutes from our house, this cemetery, but she adamantly would not go visit it. And then she got married, ultimately got remarried 10 years after. And you know, then 40 years after that, when she passed away, ended up being buried in like this family plot out in Collierville, Tennessee, which is where her folks were from originally. And so like her mom and grandma were visited there, and my stepfather's buried there. And I just knew that it was not okay for my dad, who had done what he did, even if he hadn't, honestly, to be buried alone. You know, he wasn't with his St. Louis family. He wasn't with his military family. He wasn't with his biological family. And it broke her heart, and it broke my heart. But I also knew that she, being sort of I would say an emotionally fragile person, didn't have the capacity to handle what it would take to have his body moved. I knew she could. I mean, logistically it turned out to be hard too, and I don't think she would have been up for that process. But also, I just don't think she could have handled the idea of him being disinterred and cremated, although she wanted him to be at Arlington. So I thought, okay, I'll wait until she's gone, and then I'm going to make it happen. And I thought it would be super, super easy, and it was not. It was very difficult. She passed away in July of 2019. Yeah. It took me a few months to get her affairs in order, and then the first thing I did, like November, December, got on the phone with Arlington. It's like, hey, can we do this thing? Thinking, sure, you know, and that didn't happen. You know, first of all, they just told me we do not deal with families. You know, you have to have a funeral home as an intermediary. So I called the funeral home attached to the cemetery. They were lovely. Talked to a young woman who, you know, we made up a whole plan about where, you know, how we would get his body transported by train. Because I was gonna, you know, I wasn't asking Arlington to pay for any of it. I mean, I was gonna do it myself. I just wanted it to happen. And we had it all figured out, and then COVID hit. And I figured, okay, this is a cemetery and a funeral home. They've got other things to do. I can wait a little longer. So I waited like a year and a half, called him back. That young woman had left, had to start all over with a new guy. And the first thing he did, wisely, was call Arlington. And they're like, nope, can't happen. Because there's a code, part of that, there's a little tiny section in Arlington code that says if they've placed a marker, he had just a classic bronze marker, and it's a flat one. If they've placed a marker elsewhere for someone, that person cannot be buried in Arlington. And I was like, that's great. And the guy, he felt bad. He's like, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. He actually gave me the name of the guy he talked to at Arlington. I got on the phone with him, and that guy shut me down. And I have a brother-in-law who's a lawyer. And he said, look, for one thing, this code was written after your dad died. So he said, you do have that. But he said, if you're going to do this, you got to go on with the big guns. He said, you can't just go in and you get one appeal. And you can't just say the same thing all over again. So you need to go through your congressman's office. And so I contacted Congressman Fleischman's office. He has a man who is his military veteran liaison, Jules Du. I write it, I've emailed it, I can't pronounce it, but he was wonderful. He was incredibly diligent. And what he found out is that all you have to do is pick the marker up. I mean, it took a long time. I also had to get proof that my dad had been in good standing when he was killed in action, which felt insulting, but I understand it's bureaucracy, and it's the government, and it's the military, and so that took months to get that. And then there was a law, there is a state law that prohibits the disinterment of a body for transportation across state lines. The Shelby County Health Department was just like nothing doing. They just had their own thing going on, and so they just didn't want to do it. And so Judge Boyd Patterson here, Jules got in touch with Boyd Patterson, and he wrote a court order here, and then I retained a lawyer in Memphis. He found one who works with military veteran things. Found a lawyer in Memphis, and he filed something with the court in Shelby County, and that was another several months. So by the time we finally got clearance, I got a call, because also the woman from Memorial Park Funeral Home in Memphis was lovely, and she was hand delivering stuff to the health department, trying to say, look, it's all good, we can do this. And she called me, I want to say on Christmas Eve of 24, very close to that, saying, can you be here on January 2nd to witness his disinterment? And because they do suggest you have a witness, you don't have to, but I certainly wanted to be there. And so
you had about 9 days, 8
yeah,
days, something like that.
So I was like, I'm out of here. So I got up, like 3 a.m. and drove to Memphis on January 2nd, and got there about 8 a.m, and the backhoes were already starting. And it's just like, backhoes, that just feels, that's hard. You want people out there with like the way they do an archaeological dig. You want like little brushes and a backhoe, but it's like that's.
It's like one of those things you don't want to see the process.
And that's why I thought my mom couldn't deal with that. But the man with the backhoe, he was their oldest employee, and the woman from the funeral home was standing there with me. She said, this guy could land a rocket on the moon. She goes, he dug his own wife's grave. He is so respectful. Everybody, they didn't stand on the vault. They were so respectful. And I think they understood. She knew the story, at least somewhat. I could tell that they knew that it was really, everybody's loved one is important. So I don't want to put it that way, but I think they understood the gravity of the process that they were helping with, and they could not have been more respectful. But
being buried at the Arlington National Cemetery is a big deal, and I think that weight comes with this process for sure. And when we made it happen and got him to Arlington.
Detail! Attend her!
The Marines who were involved in this process in Arlington, they all did that 1,000-yard gaze thing, where they never made eye contact. And I was looking at them and I was thinking, do they know who my dad is? I mean, do they have any idea? Because they do this all the time. And I wouldn't expect them to know, but when the officer who presented me with the flag knelt down in front of me and handed me the flag and said the words that are, part of the ceremony, and, thanking me, on behalf of the country and all that for my dad's service, his voice broke.
On behalf of the President of the United States, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for his loved ones' honorable service to country and Corps.
And I thought, well, that's unusual. And I had the active Navy military family member that I had the opportunity to meet there last week. I said, would they have known anything? Would they know the biography? He said, oh yeah, they know. They know who they're burying. They've read the citations. They know. And that was incredibly meaningful. Everything about it, the care, the precision, the diligence, the incredible amount of respect was truly meaningful. And I'm very grateful for that.
You mentioned on the phone that when your father was disinterred, that he was buried in a glass. Explain that.
Yeah. When I met the woman there in Memphis, she had she wanted to make sure that she knew what to expect. And she said, okay, this is weird, but she goes, he's buried in an oversized vault, the concrete thing that goes around the casket. And she said, because my mom had bought 2 plots, and then she didn't end up being buried in the second one. She was buried out in Collierville, but it ended up that this vault took up more than 1 plot. And so she said, was your dad a big man? I said, no, he was just average size, probably your size, average size guy, and she goes, I don't understand why, but she said, it says on this paperwork that he was buried in an oversized vault. And so sure enough, she said, yeah, that's way bigger. And she showed me what a normal one looks like, and it was taller, it was deeper. They were afraid they wouldn't be able to get it on the truck because she didn't want to take the top off, which was as far as I was going to go. I was going to watch them take the top off. I was going to stand back to make sure nothing was compromised because
sure.
I did, And at that point, I was going to leave it with her. But she was afraid they wouldn't even be able to get it on the truck because of its dimensions. And they were going to put up like fencing so they could take the top off there. But it turned out they barely got on the truck. They took it to a place kind of off out of public view, used a winch, took the top off, and she walked around and looked at it. And then she called me over, and I looked, and it was this beautiful. I was expecting like a very basic military casket, and it was this very tall, top to bottom, sort of bronze copper colored casket with a big crucifix, because he was a very devout Catholic. And but the main thing was just so tall. And she said, I've never seen anything quite like this, but okay. And I left it with her, and she said, if there's anything on him, any effects do you want me to, that's salvageable, do you want me to keep it? I said, yes, of course, because I don't have much from him. I mean, almost nothing. And I went to visit a friend. I just had to, kind of get out of my head. Went to visit an old friend that I'd gone to school with forever, and by the time I pulled up in her driveway, this woman had called me, and she said, okay, so the reason the casket was so tall is because there's a double lid, and the interior lid is glass, and he's buried under glass. And I was like, okay. And she said, I've never seen anything like it, but she said and I said, like Snow White? And she goes, yeah, I like Snow White. And she said, and the first thing I saw were his wings, and they were shining like they had just been polished. Do you want them? I said, yes, of course. And so anyway, she said, okay, well, I got in a hotel room, and she said his cremains will be ready tomorrow. And so I went, stayed in the hotel, found stuff to do to just get my mind off stuff. And the next morning went to pick up his cremains, and I expected her to just hand me a box, I give her a check, she hands me a box, and instead she said, she sat me down, she said, do you want me to tell you what I saw? And I was like, yeah, I do. And she said, so, and she's clearly a very spiritual woman, and she said, I have been praying that there was some identification on him. She said, obviously, I've got the paperwork. I know this is who it is. I just need to, for my own satisfaction, because it's such an old disinterment, I need to know that it's really him. And she said, in fact, the toe tag was there with his name on it, although when we got it out, the ink started just disappearing, and clearly it was an oxygen deprived environment. And she said, but I didn't need that because I had met you now that you're here, and I saw his face. And she said, you look just like him. And so that was also a lot to think about and process going home, because I thought, did I just mess something up? I mean, but ultimately I felt like maybe it's, no, I'm doing the right thing. And I did look it up later. I like, how common is that? Because she'd never seen anything like that. And I found an article that this is an old Southern thing, apparently, and it allows for a body to be preserved for visitation and survive the heat. Of course, I don't know. This was December. I don't know what my uncle, I'm sure he did it. Old Southern family. I know my mom did not want an open casket, and my dad's family wanted one, probably because they hadn't seen him in a long time, and this is their chance to see him. And I think that was part of their faith tradition, to have an open casket. My mom did not want it, and I think my sweet uncle was trying to thread that needle, you know, make it feel a little more comfortable for her. But and apparently they do have like an end cap in these, and they literally put a candle in and suck the oxygen out, and then seal it back up. And so I texted the woman from the funeral home, and I said, here's what I found out, that it's supposed to preserve the body. And she said, it worked. So it's a strange story, but it's, I don't know, you know, it just felt meaningful. I wasn't sure what the meaning was, but it felt meaningful. But it felt like the closest to him that I'll ever get.